Your next film assignment will be abstract forms, and this is where you will be utilizing different types of lighting, highlights, and shadows with paper. So, this whole idea of using kind of very basic materials like paper dates back to very early photography. There was an American photographer, Francis Bergerier, who moved to London in 1928, and that's where he really started to experiment with non representational photography. So, this is photography that does not look like anything specific. Prior to this, it was all pretty much landscapes and portraits and pictures of pretty things. But he kind of went into the realm of taking pictures of just art for art. So he, in a lot of series of his artwork, used cut paper abstractions to um, make his photography. So he found this very specific beauty in how cut paper that's manipulated and folded looked um, when manipulated with a light. So, depending on how the light was hitting the paper, the different cuts, the different folds would create shadows and highlights that would create these subtle qualities of beauty throughout. And something very simple like paper created these complex patterns of texture and form. So here are a few more examples of work that he did. And back in the early 1900s, there was no color photography, there was no digital. This was all done with black and white film. So, because of that, the shadows would end up being this really rich black color. And then the highlights, a lot of times, would be almost blown out and really, really bright and white. But then you would get this nice range of all the grays in between. Another artist that kind of fell into this realm was Jaroslav Rusler. He was a Czech avant garde photographer who really became known for combining different styles of modern photography and brought in cubism, futurism, constructivism, new objectivity, and abstraction. So these were all movements within the art world, not only in photography, but also in paintings, drawing, and sculpture. His photographs often reduced images to really looking at the basic lines and shapes that were created. Um, so the way he would cut and fold his paper, he was looking at how the shapes ended up being and how the edges, the lines worked. From there, he really explored the contrast of light and shadow. So, depending on how he lit his paper, he would have these very um, dark shadows along with those brighter whites. He also kind of delved into a lot of different techniques, including photograms and double exposure, where he would use multiple images to create one. A few more examples of his. Once again, back in early 1900s, didn't have the color, didn't have the digital, but they did have other ways to experiment with some color. So the image on the left, he was using something called a sepia toner, which is what gave it that kind of brown, earthy color to it. But not only did the OG artists do this, but also there are a lot of more modern contemporary artists that also worked with this whole idea of using paper. So Veiko Sagar is a contemporary artist who did a whole series called Antimatter, where he combined cut paper abstractions, similar to what Francis did with some of his charcoal drawings, but where Francis explored more of the dramatic contrast of light and shade. Sagar's photos were a lot lighter in tone. So he really wasn't focusing on the really rich blacks versus the whites. He was looking more at kind of those lighter tones. And with his, he simply just took flat paper and cut little slices in the middle using an X-Acto knife and just lifted them up a little bit. So some of the cuts were shorter and straighter, and this really created subtle disruptions in the paper's surface. So that's what didn't really create a lot of that stark contrast, because there wasn't a lot to kind of block light to create shadows when light was hitting it. A lot of his pieces are reminiscent of kind of architect models. So a few more examples of his. Okay, so very simple, very basic, but once again, it does become all about kind of that line work that's created, and you do get some of that contrast like right beneath where those cuts are lifted up a little bit. Jerry Reed is another photographer. So his work, he was really looking at how to shape something very two-dimensional like paper and give it edges and volume, so make it more three-dimensional. So he would a lot of times take his paper and stack it, fold it, have it kind of leaning up against itself to create more of that three-dimensional form. And also very, very basic. His image on the left just has two pieces of paper that are cut, but he went and just folded them, in one spot, just at a 90-degree angle. But by having that 90-degree angle and where his light is positioned, he was able to create, additional shapes with the really, really dark shadows. Tamara Lorenz is a German artist who started working with color. So she used colored paper and would almost collage it and cut it, slice and dice it, put it back together to create a contrast using those lines, shapes, tones, and textures. So each image kind of created its own little reality in a sense. Some more images of hers, and you can see she was really mixing different colored paper and some different textures. She would use cardstock that was a little bit thicker, and then she would use paper that's thinner, and that kind of added some more dimension as well. So not limited to just regular white copy paper. You can bring in color as well, and that will kind of give it its own unique ideas. This artist, James Wellington, did not use paper, but he used something called phyllo pastry dough that really resembled sheets of paper. So he would create this dough, roll it out really, really thin, and start to crumple shards of it. And he would drape it, he would rip it, he would do all sorts of things to it. And when he was using it, he kind of had reminiscence of it looking like fabric as well. So he photographed all of this, but kind of that same idea with the paper, just using a slightly different material. So some more of his images, and you can tell it looks more fabric-like, but because of the dough, it did act more like paper, where he was able to crease it and fold it in specific ways. So here are some miscellaneous artists, just to give some more ideas of what can be done. So these were all done with color paper. Some are more of the lay flat, where the paper is just laying flat on a backdrop, like the image on the left, and shot from above, so that bird's eye view. While others, like the one on the right, you're starting to get more foreground, middle ground, and background. It almost looks like a landscape where you have, things really, really up close that are blurry, things that are in the middle ground that are a little bit more in focus. But once again, all done with paper. So for this project, there's a lot of ways you can experiment. So you'll have access to all different kinds of paper. Copy paper, we have tons of construction paper. If you would like to bring paper from home, like tissue paper, wrapping paper, you are more than welcome to. But ultimately, it's how you manipulate the paper and then how you light and photograph it. So this artist took just regular white paper and created a lot of folds. They just folded the paper in all different ways, and then they opened it up. So those folds and creases are still prominent. The paper still does lift up a little bit in areas, and that's how you're able to get that variation with the shadows and the highlights when it's lit. If you're into origami, you could create origami pieces and then unfold them, and you could have some pretty interesting fold markings from that. Some more examples with folded paper. Ripping paper is just really, really easy. Depending on the type of paper you have, depending what kind of fiber it's made out of, you can get these really, really soft edges versus if you're just cutting paper with scissors or an X-Acto knife. So those subtle differences can definitely alter what your final images look like. Just cutting into the paper, lifting it up, folding it. So the process, what to do and turn in. So you're going to find paper. So any kind, white colored paper, printed on paper. As I mentioned, you'll have access to regular copy paper. We have boxes of just random construction paper that they're not full pieces. They're just random chunks of paper. You can also bring in your own. So as I mentioned, tissue paper. Tissue paper will give you a different look than solid construction paper because it's a little bit more translucent. Lighting will do something different with it. So I do recommend, if you want to kind of explore other options, to dig around at home and see what you got. You can hit up the Dollar Tree and get some tissue paper there. You can share with some friends in the class. So just paper, that is our material. So super, super easy. For the studio space, we do have backdrop stands that you will be working on. What's nice about them is that they are sturdy and have this nice sloped white backdrop to it already, made out of kind of a plastic, almost plexiglass. But you are able to clip paper onto it. So if you don't want white, you can take some black butcher paper, clip it on, and have a black backdrop if you would like that. We might also have some gray paper, but we definitely have black. And then you'll have your light source. So the light source, you're going to be using the same flashlights that you used for the lighting basics. So you'll have that one light source. If you do need additional light sources, I will have some available. But one should be enough to really give you some nice contrast with your lighting, with the shadows and the highlights. Manipulating the paper. So that's going to be what you'll be working on today in class. So you'll take whatever paper you got. You're going to fold, crumple, cut, attach, origami the paper. The idea is to make the paper no longer flat. So even if you fold it, you can unfold it, but it won't be flat because those folds will still naturally lift the paper up a little bit. But what you do with the paper is totally up to you. I do suggest trying different things. Don't just crumple up all your paper in 2 seconds and say, I'm done, because you're going to have really boring pictures in the end. They're all going to look really similar. You're going to be bored editing them. I'm going to be bored grading them. So try different things. Okay? There's a ton of examples that were in this PowerPoint that you can try. In addition to just manipulating the paper, how could the paper stand on itself? There were some artists that had the paper standing up and leaning against each other, and that gave more of a sculptural look versus something that was just flat with some little slits cut into it. So the idea is the paper is no longer flat. Remember the egg. So that's going to be with the lighting of the paper. So hopefully you all did your lighting basics. So this is really all about shadows and highlights. How does the paper transform with different styles of lighting? Lighting is key for this. You will be working with a partner. So just like before, one person will take all of their pictures. You'll have the whole block to take your pictures, and then the next block you will flip-flop, and the other person will take their pictures. So your partner is really going to be your lighting assistant. So you'll be able to guide them as to where to hold the flashlight, how close, how far away, what angle, where it should go. When you photograph, you'll be photographing this next class. So we'll have all the stands prepped and set up for you. So the idea is to create at least 4 different setups to do. So 4 different ways that you've manipulated the paper. This will give you that variety so that you're not bored taking the pictures, editing them, and I'm not bored looking at them. Composition, 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 and more composition. That's going to be key. Okay, so remember rule of thirds. Remember cropping. You can do bird's eye view. You can do worm's eye view with this. Frame within a frame. Well, what if you have paper that has that frame cut into it and you're shooting through it into some crumpled paper? That will give you a totally different look than just crumpled paper. So really think back to all of that. Yes, you will be able to edit a little bit and do some cropping, but don't always rely on that. You start with good photographs, you'll end up with great photographs in the end. As you're shooting, you are going to be using shallow depth of field. So remember, you will have your camera set to A or AV. So that is our aperture priority. So you'll have it at kind of one of those little numbers, because that will help push your depth of fields where you can really get some nice, areas of sharp focus, but areas of blur. And you'll see in some of the next examples of student work how that kind of looks. As far as how many pictures you take, the more pictures you take, the better. Ideally, take at least 20, so that way you have a good foundation, but you will have the whole class period to take pictures. So just take pictures. Take pictures, take pictures. Okay? With your setup, try 5 different angles of the same light source. Have the light from above, from behind, from the side, closer, further away, and you'll see that that will give you unique images for each one. Okay, so 20 images isn't that daunting. Okay, just keep taking pictures. Okay. In the end, you will be making a contact sheet as we've done in the past. You'll be editing pictures, so we'll dive into Lightroom soon. So from all of the pictures you take, you're going to be picking the 10 that you're most proud of and editing them. You can have a couple that have, some repeats as the same picture, but the editing's different. So for example, if you want to turn your picture into black and white, you definitely can, and keep another version in color, you can do that as well. but we'll go into more details when we get to that point. And then just turning in, you'll have your contact sheet and then your edited photos. So here are examples of student work from the past, just so you can see what students have done. So this student went very sculptural with their setup. Students were given, part of the class before to create kind of their setups and scenarios and kind of what they wanted to do. So the student really thought about building kind of almost like this house out of paper, and then they had little pieces of paper on the inside. If you look at their composition, they're following rule of thirds. Okay, their paper is not dead center, it's kind of off to the side, so that kind of creates that visual movement. Crumpled paper. Okay, but you can definitely see how the lighting comes into play with this. You have those rich shadows towards the left, brighter highlights towards the right. So the light source was most likely from above and kind of towards the right hand side a little bit. Okay. Don't be afraid to zoom in. Okay. A lot of the really successful pictures that students have taken, their paper is filling the whole frame and it's being cropped. So this image itself, it really does become about the texture that the paper has from it being crumpled a little bit, but also the lines of the edges of the paper. If you have color paper, that gives you a different look than if you have white paper. The student very specifically cut the paper into different kind of organic shapes and had some negative space and windows and openings. So that kind of created its own kind of landscape feel to it. Okay, same with this one, very specifically cut and kind of curved. Okay, their choice of lighting, they're kind of lighting from the left hand side but towards the center of their paper, so that's how you have that brightness in the middle but the darkness towards the foreground. Okay, and also their composition, very strong. It's not right in the middle. They have this nice negative space of darkness above. Okay, so it kind of balances out. So we've got tons and tons of images. Okay, this is more translucent paper, so you can see the light is from below, from underneath the paper. So that gives it a different look. And the color changes depending on the light and how bright it is in the middle versus towards the outside in the shadows. Okay, some white tissue paper, so you can definitely see how translucent that is. But where all the creases are, where it's kind of crinkled and crumpled, you get those darker shadows. Twisting the paper. So experiment and try different things. Okay. So I do have some examples of maybe the not most successful. So this is one of them. So why is this not the most successful? Well, first off, there's copyright infringement. The cutout that the student used is one of those characters from some video game thing. So that's a big no-no. Don't do that. Don't plagiarize, don't copyright, don't steal things that you did not come up with. Don't use the Chanel or Nike logo and cut that out or anything like that. So that number one, not so good. Second, it's just flat. Okay, the paper's still flat. There's no, you know, highlights and shadows being formed because it's just laying there. Plus the editing is just really dark. The picture's just dark overall. So this, not so good. This one. Okay, so overall, the lighting, they did a pretty good job. You got some shadows, some highlights. But if you look at the composition, it is dead center. Not following rule of thirds at all. You just look at it and stop. There's all that empty space all the way around. So the composition just needs work. So the student, could have, edited it better in Lightroom to crop it a different way. So just avoid things just dead in the center. This one, some good, crumpling of paper, some interesting lighting, but blurry. So blurry. Do not turn in blurry pictures. You will be using tripods. Tripods will be your friends. Because the lights will be off, you'll have that limited light. Tripod will be your friend. Okay? Don't think you can just hold your camera nice and steady, because you won't be able to, and you will get blurry pictures. And blurry pictures are sad. They're very sad. Unless they're intentional, but this is definitely not intentional. Then we've got this one. Whole lot of things wrong with this one. We got a hand holding the paper, so that's kind of a no-no. It's distracting. It shouldn't be there. The lighting is not so great. And then also you can see beyond the backdrop off to the left. Okay, so just a lot of stuff that's not so great. Okay. And this one could have been good. It had potential. Okay, the student did something interesting with how they were folding and kind of curling the paper. But once again, they were not paying attention to composition. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the edge of the paper, of the backdrop, and whatever is behind. Okay? So always, always, always pay attention to what is happening around your main subject. Okay? The paper is not going to be big. Okay? So the space you have to work with, you should be able, in theory, to avoid taking pictures of stuff that's off the backdrop. So this is just, the what to do and what to turn in. But we will really today be focusing on just creating and manipulating paper. And then we'll be photographing the next couple classes.